Hello, I'm Diana Reich, the Artistic Director of the Charleston Literary Festival based in South Carolina, USA. I would like to welcome you from wherever in the world that you may be watching. If the past fraught 18 months has taught us anything, it has taught us that books and their authors, whether classical or contemporary, really matter. In trying times, readers turn to books for insights into the human condition, for the opportunity to be transported to other worlds, for ideas, for arguments, for inspiration, for experiencing the impossible, for laughter, and for the release of tears. The festival will provide the opportunity to engage with a galaxy of literary and artistic stars, as well as up-and-coming writers who are making waves. We have a far-flung cast list featuring authors from all over the United States, as well as the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Whether they're talking about former literary trailblazers, or gene editing, or human rights, or popular culture, or feminism, or medieval nuns, or innumerable other subjects, they have one thing in common: the ability of compelling stories to linger in our imaginations. We're grateful to all our speakers, whether virtual or in person, for sharing their talents. Please thank them by purchasing their books. The festival couldn't happen without a committed team and board. We would like to thank our donors, both private and public, who generously make the festival possible. The College of Charleston, our academic partner, has been an invaluable source of support. It's no accident that the festival takes place in Charleston, a prime destination with a progressive literary and artistic tradition. Please come and see for yourselves, but make sure to visit during the Charleston Literary Festival, which takes place during the first half of November each year. Meanwhile, I hope that you enjoy the 2021 Charleston Literary Festival and that it makes you think and dream afresh.
Hello, everybody. We are live. I'm Sarah, and I'm really happy to be here this morning to introduce you all to this Charleston Literary Festival event. Today's discussion features Geoffrey Harpham in conversation with award-winning author Colm Tóibín about his most recent novel, The Magician, where Tóibín imagines himself inside the head of German writer Thomas Mann. As I was thinking about this introduction, one sentence from Tóibín's book jumped out at me. There's a scene where a middle-aged exiled Thomas Mann is preparing to give a lecture to a packed audience in Chicago. And reflecting on this, Mann notes that before his speech, quote, "As always, the introduction was too long and too effusive," close quote. So with this in mind today, I will make the introduction brief, but I refuse to make it any less effusive because I am genuinely really excited to welcome Colm Tóibín. Tóibín's expansive and imaginative work includes 12 novels, 3 collections of essays, plays, poems, an opera libretto, and a wild number of articles and reviews. 3 of his novels, The Blackwater Lightship, The Master, and The Testament of Mary, were all shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and his novel Brooklyn was adapted into a BAFTA award-winning film. Tóibín is a recipient of many awards, including an Irish Pen Award for contribution to Irish literature. He is currently the Silverman Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University and the Chancellor of the University of Liverpool. He also runs a small publishing imprint in Dublin, Tusker Rock Press. Today's conversation will be steered by academic Geoffrey Harpham, President Emeritus of the National Humanities Centre and Senior Fellow at Duke University. Harpham is the author of several groundbreaking scholarly books, including The Humanities and the Dream of America, Language Alone, The Critical Fetish of Modernity, and Scholarship and Freedom. Today's talk will be around an hour in duration, with the final 10 to 15 minutes dedicated to audience questions. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat room throughout the discussion as they occur to you, and we can revisit them at the end. So please join me in welcoming Colm Tóibín and Geoffrey Harpham. Let's give them some lovely virtual hip hip hoorays. Over to you now, Geoffrey.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Colm, for agreeing to this conversation. I've been looking forward to it for a long time, certainly since I read The Magician, which is earlier this year. I note that this is not the first project of this sort that you've done. You also have a book called The Master, in which you do something comparable with Henry James. And this suggests to me that you have not just a single project in mind, but a whole project. And I'd like to ask you what the significance of this project is. It can't be just an attempt to write the lives of the poets. There must be something more personal at stake for you. What is that? How would you describe it?
Geoffrey, I don't have a third. I wish I could tell you that I had a long list and that every decade, as many decades as I have left, I was going to do one more. I think these are the only two. And I suppose with both Henry James and Thomas Mann, it begins with loving the books. It begins with reading the books, believing that they came from a great sort of confident imagination, someone who really knew what they were doing was producing these very finished objects, like Thomas Mann's novel Buddenbrooks or Henry James's Portrait of a Lady, that they came from strength. I certainly believed that when I read them first, when I was in my late teens, early 20s. When I realized, with Thomas Mann, it was really when 3 biographies came out at the same time in English in 1996, that they came out of weakness. They came out of loss. They came tentatively, and they came out of an imagination, and indeed out of a personality or a character that was wounded, that suffered anguish, that really didn't know what they were doing. That it was so tentative sometimes. And also that the personalities involved, and this would include Henry James, were fully ambiguous. In other words, that if you said about Henry James, oh, he loved his family, which he did, he got away from them as quickly as he could and stayed away. That he was neither English nor American, that he had quite a lot of money, he'd inherited a lot of money, but he was always worried about money, that he was highly social, but he really wanted to be solitary. And that he loved women, and his best friends were women, but that he was homosexual. And with Mann, almost the same things exist, except it's later on. It's I think Freud makes a big difference, or the sort of freedoms that came with the sort of climate of opinion that Freud brought into being. But also, his politics are very hard to pin down. His sexuality is hard to pin down. But his relationship with loss isn't really hard to pin down. It is that he lost Lübeck, which was the town that he was not only brought up in, but he belonged there in a fundamental way. He was a young prince there, and his father died when he was a teenager, and they went to Munich, and he was nobody in Munich, whereas he'd been really somebody in Lübeck. And also later on in 1933, he lost Germany. And he recovered them, or he recuperated, he got them back. Buddenbrooks, his first novel, was Lübeck, building it brick by brick or year by year, person by person. And so too with a novel, Dr. Faustus, which attempted to do the same thing with Germany.
Let me get back to the personal stakes that you might have in such projects. I note, by the way, in one of the biographies of Thomas Mann that you, I think, were referring to, Ronald Hayman's book, Mann's brother Heinrich is quoted as saying that Thomas was incapable of truly understanding another mind. And your book takes a completely different premise, that not only did Mann understand other minds, he cast himself in the figures of various figures in his books, including von Aschenbach and Death in Venice, and Hanno and Buddenbrooks, and maybe even Professor Kuckuck and Felix Krull, and 100 other characters. I was wondering if you saw yourself somehow in Mann and James, but let's talk particularly about Mann. Did you recognize the self that you saw? Are you exploring some aspect of yourself that would have been more difficult to come at directly?
In certain ways I am, but it's almost the opposite way around, where I came to Mann, and then the things that began to interest me in him were things that came from elements of myself that are unresolved, that sort of matter, and that I can't really work out. He was the second. I mean, Heinrich would insult him in that way, in that he was the second son in a family of 5, as am I. He was someone who lost a parent in his teenage years, he lost his father, I lost my father. And also the idea of losing Lübeck. I mean, it's a much more minor thing for me, but I come from a small town in Ireland, and where you were always recognized on the street, and people just knew who you were, and you had a sense of that. It wasn't a sense of self-importance, but a sense of being enclosed and known. And obviously, when I left Enniscorthy and I lived in Dublin, that wasn't true. And then when I lived in other places, so that idea of losing somewhere. I also came to America, I also sort of lived as a homosexual in a dark time, in a time in Ireland. It wasn't the criminal part of it that mattered as much as the unmentionable part of it. That as I was growing up, it was simply unmentionable. And you sort of lived with that, and you navigated and you worked your way around it. So in those areas, I found that when I was treating those areas in Mann, I treated them with some intensity and with great interest and with a sort of drama, feeling that I really knew my ground here.
It seemed to me that there's, in addition, perhaps to some deep personal interest in the project of possessing or penetrating or occupying another mind, there might be a professional interest as well, because this is, after all, what literature does, doesn't it? It enables the readers to occupy temporarily and provisionally the minds of other people. And of course, the writer has to do this to begin with in a far more intense way. Would it be too much to say that in this book and in its predecessor about Henry James, you're actually exploring, in a professional sense, the power, the capacity of literature to occupy other minds?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working with that idea that if in the case of these two writers, that nothing was lost, that no matter what experience they went through, they had use for it. Now, that's something obviously I know about. It's something I do. It's a strange way of living. In other words, it really does worry people around you sometimes when you've put something directly into a book that happened, or that really belongs to somebody else more than it belongs to you. In other words, you're in I mean, I know that there's a movement at the moment against appropriation, but the business of writing is a constant appropriation. It's sentence by sentence appropriation sometimes. In other words, you're changing your own experience, or you're using it directly, or you're using someone else's experience. And in the case of Mann, I think this was really quite serious, because he really did create a portrait of his family in Buddenbrooks, but also in Death in Venice. He wrote it just on returning from Venice, where those experiences had occurred. We know this from his wife's memoir. And of course, the Magic Mountain happens because his wife is in a sanatorium in Davos, and he goes to see her. And
chooses to stay.
Yes, and so there's he gets this novel where Hans Castorp, instead of staying 3 weeks, stays 7 years. And of course, his wife is utterly amused at the idea. You made me into a man. That's how fabulous. But also, he used so much of the actual life of the sanatorium that she had told him about and she had experienced. And later on in Dr. Faustus, a portrait of his mother, of his sister's suicide. So that there's so much he's using. We could use the word appropriation, we could use the word use, but nonetheless, he's building his novels from life. He is that this is the novel form is not a pure form. It's not like lyric poetry. That it's really an impure form in which the way in which experience and imagination sort of circle each other is I think complex, and I'm sort of working with that. I'm interested in how much he's using, but also in the fact that his real life is silent in the study. And then when he comes out of the study, he's at a loss sometimes to know what the man is, to know what to do, because his family makes so much noise and they're also filled with life, and he's not. He's a ghost sometimes in that world. Right. And I suppose I'm writing about that idea of how ghostly he is sometimes, and then other times when he works, he's so direct and so serious and so present as he's making sentences.
Yeah. It's what goes on when he's making sentences that really interests me, or rather, I'm interested to hear your account of it. At the end of chapter 13 in your book, Mann ruminates on how hard it would be to show from what strange depths this book, and he's talking about Dr. Faustus, had come. And in fact, you never do show from what strange depths it comes. You refer to magic or alchemy, but you never try to represent what's going on in the mind of the novelist at the point of creation. Mann ponders a book and Buddenbrooks appears, or he ponders the Joseph story in the Bible, and 4 volumes and 1,500 pages appear. In other words, books just appear, but you never go into the study with him to try to represent what's going on. Is this because it's just impossible, or because you don't want to do it?
Yeah, it's impossible. I mean, I did try. The problem is, in a way, that to try and build how a novel is made and dramatize the actual making of a novel, you need to begin with the idea, first of all, that the reader has read that novel. In the case of Mann, in English, you can't do that now. He isn't being read in the same way as he's being read in Germany. So that you have to be, so that you think, if once I start this, I will lose most readers who simply won't be able to follow where I'm going, because unless I actually reproduce the chapter I'm talking about. I could do it with Death in Venice. If you notice in the book, Death in Venice is a short text. It's easy to explain what's happening in the text. It's easy to show how he got the story from actually being in Venice the previous year. All the elements. For example, Gustav Mahler, the composer, had just died, so you can see the novella taking shape very easily. With a novel as huge as Dr. Faustus, I can merely give you his worries at the beginning, but as he goes through writing the book, if I start it, I'm going to lose the human element, and I'm going to lose it big time. And I know, because I cut 55,000 words from this book. And I cut 55,000 words of precisely what you're asking about, which is clunky accounts of how a novel was written, technically built up over time. And when I read the book, I realized this is falling away immediately. This has to go. And the payoff, if it goes, is that I get this chapter 17, which is the death of his son by suicide, Klaus, and his being in Stockholm, and the 3 or 4 days as his family thinks about this. If the previous chapter is a big account of him in his study trying to deal with, for example, the technicalities of 12-tone musical composition as invented by Arnold Schoenberg, trying to give this to his character who has made a pact with the devil, who big long lectures on Beethoven Opus 111, Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. The next, simply the human thing that's happening will be lost in the next chapter. So in other words, a big decision had to be made. And the question you're asking is the question. In other words, well, like, what do you do with the life of a novelist if the novels are big, complex things that need an extraordinary amount of explanation to come to life? And the answer is, I tried it, I couldn't do it, and I had a payoff if I cut it, which was that I would get a much more stark and dramatic version of what his life was like, rather than what his work was like. So I had to abandon any sense of my book as a piece of literary criticism. I had to do exactly the same thing with the historical background. If I had too much about inflation in the 20s, the rise of Hitler in the 20s, how did National Socialism emerge in the 20s, or even the sort of arguments between the exiles in the 30s, or even, for example, he goes to the White House. Now he spends time with Roosevelt. And if I put that into the book, here it is, a set scene. Thomas Mann, the great German intellectual, speaks to the American president. And I realized, don't write that. Don't try it. Don't go there. It's much more fun to have Roosevelt's busy. That one of the mornings he's there, Roosevelt's busy. So it doesn't see him at all. And another time they just have they have a very dull dinner together. But don't attempt a set scene, because again you lose the emotion, you lose the impetus. So there were two things that I had to work out how to just keep in the shadows. One was the work, oddly enough, and the other was the actual extraordinary dramatic historical background, oddly enough. So what I got was a third, which was the I think an historian could do the second. I think a literary critic can do the first. And I'm a novelist. So what I'm dealing with is actually in this book is his life as a man, his life with his family, his life once he closes the door of his study, leaving it. And all you have to do as a reader is imagine the life inside the study, and also imagine what's going on, the rumblings that are going on out in the world, while I deal with his, in essence, where his private life, his life as a man, his life in the world. So, those were big decisions that had to be made. I promise you the alternatives were disastrous.
I doubt that those 55,000 words that you cut were all that clunky, and I hope that they see the light of day in some form, in some way, because what strikes me is that what remains mysterious or magical is what happens in the translation of experience at the moment of composition. In other words, that alchemy enables you to produce something out of what you have. But let me ask another question that arises from your book. In contemplating the writing of Dr. Faustus, Thomas Mann realizes in your account that he must summon the courage to entertain evil, and that he would have to open the door to what was darkly outside his own comprehension. He speaks of signing a pact with some dark force in order to write. What's that all about? And have you signed any such pact?
I think that it's a big question. For me, it starts with a correspondence going on during the Vietnam War between the poet Thomas Levertov and the poet Robert Duncan, which she says you have to oppose evil as a writer. And he says, no, you have to imagine it. And it's a great debate. And I was interested. And I think, that so much of the time you're writing social novels. In other words, you're writing about how people live in the world. And the novel is a secular space. It loves money, it loves destiny, choices, chances, human chances. And it hates the intervention of the divine. It's just not good with that. It's not good with he prayed for money and money poured down. No. You can't do that in a novel. It's all about losing money or how he gets money. So the novel is it's a bourgeois space. It's a secular space, and it's a modern space, to what it's in which magic is missing. Now, once you start trying to think, how can I do anything with this? How can I usurp this? I did it in a novel called House of Names, where I went back to the Greek stories. I did it in Testament of Mary, where I imagined the crucifixion in some detail. And so it was on my mind, this idea of taking in some much darker thing into the novel. And he's listening, as he's thinking, as in the scene you described, he's listening to Beethoven's Opus 132. Those sort of soaring late quartets of Beethoven, which are so filled with pain and so filled in also with sort of gorgeousness and glory. And then, they're really religious works. They're trying to deal with the spirit.
Some of
the symphonies are so material. These string quartets are not.
It's a great writerly challenge, isn't it, to try to describe another art. And Mann does it in Dr. Faustus and elsewhere, and you do it in this book as well. I want to ask you, both James and Thomas Mann had not unacknowledged, but certainly unrealized desires for men. And I want to ask you if you think that their art would have been better off if they'd actually lived the life of their desires more openly, instead of suffering through this painful series of partial or frustrated encounters. What role do you think that unexpressed or unrealized desires might play in artistic creation?
That's a great question, isn't it? That, in other words, that they were both so repressed sexually that the wonder is, did that repression move over and emerge gloriously in these very big, confident books, these completed books that in James, you notice that his best novels, Portrait of a Lady, Winds of the Dove, Golden Bowl, The Ambassadors, have at their heart a secret, a sexual secret, which if it emerges, if it becomes known, will be explosive. And this is not something that, you don't find this in the same way in George Eliot, for example. And so you realize that in some way or other, his secret sexuality emerged and got dramatized and became the sort of fierce center of his fictional universe. In Mann, you can trace constantly the extraordinary connection in his work between sexual desire and decay, sexual desire and disease. It's there in them as Hannah was dying in Buddenbrooks. His friend comes and kisses his hands, and family watched it gasped at this. And, well, Death in Venice doesn't just have sex and sexual desire; it has cholera coming in. And of course, in Dr. Faustus, in the Magic Mountain, everyone has tuberculosis. Everyone has tuberculosis. And in Dr. Faustus, the extraordinary sense of syphilis, of using syphilis as a sort of as a powerful, not merely a disease, but something that actually creates excitement almost. So in Mann, it's I think much stranger than it is in James, but nonetheless, also it's possible that the sort of silence they were forced into makes its way out of silence into noise, into words, as such a relief to them that there, at least there were things they could say, and there were things they could reveal. So that, I mean, novels are filled with revelation. You're always telling the reader what secret thoughts somebody had, or what private actions were committed. And so it must have been a relief.
There's a quiet little scene near the beginning of the book where Thomas and his brother Heinrich are sitting at adjacent or maybe opposing writing tables. They're both writing. And Thomas is thinking about the young man that he met the day before. And when Heinrich leaves the room, he looks at Heinrich's manuscript and he sees deep in the pile of papers drawings of naked young women. And he said, it's curious that we're sitting here writing, and yet we're thinking such different thoughts.
But yet we're both thinking about this. When Heinrich Mann died, they found in, among his papers, large numbers of drawings of fat women naked. And they were both thinking about sex, and they were both writing, and they would write a paragraph, but the erotic, in other words, the erotic was never far away as a source of energy for Thomas Mann.
How do you think Mann would respond if he were alive and kicking and read your account of him? How do you think he would react?
He wrote himself a short novel about Goethe called The Beloved Returns, or Lotte in Weimar, which imagined Goethe as an old man falling in love with a young woman. So it's I mean, he can't very well tell me you have no right to do this. I mean, I say, well, you did it to Goethe. It's not. I didn't invent this form. So
here's a speculative question. It's possible that you yourself might be novelized in some way by some subsequent writer. Is there any writer, either in the present or the past, who you think would be up to the job? Who would you most like to be appropriated by?
I live a very dull life. There's absolutely no interest.
It would require a great novelist to
now or in the future.
You've just finished a tour of Germany, in which I think I've read the account of the Irish Times, which describes a mixed response, with one of your audience saying that there was a moral issue involved in an Irish writer taking over the life of a German artist like this. Do you see a moral issue there? What was that person talking about?
No, I don't. I'm not good on moral issues. I think that they, you see, it's very hard for Germans to find a figure in their 20th century that they can look up to. And the Mann family, the whole family, emerges very cleanly from this story. In other words, that they did not collaborate. That they, you can see all of them taking a very serious moral position. Thomas Mann's was more tentative than some of the others, but what I'm trying to point out is that this did not come from perfection. In other words, I mean, somebody asked me a serious journalist from Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is the equivalent of the New York Times, actually asked me in public, you have queered Thomas Mann. I said, well, hold on, I didn't write his diaries. He did. I didn't write Death in Venice. He did. But in other words, it's very hard to try to make a hero out of somebody. To then watch them as a closeted homosexual, or as someone who didn't denounce Hitler until 1936, which Thomas Mann didn't do. And so this is a complex story. My task is to make it both dramatic and complex. I'm sorry it's not simple. And there is no moral question involved. I mean, anyone, we're meant to live in a united, not only in a united Europe, but a globalized world. But whether we do or not, I read Thomas Mann when I was 19, and I did not think I have no right to read this because he's German and I'm Irish. Those nationality things that's the great thing about writing and read it rather than write it, is don't think for a moment, oh, so-and-so, Flannery O'Connor is from Georgia and I'm not. That's the last thing that occurs to me. Right. So, I mean, I actually thought some of it was actually quite stupid. I mean, some of those comments about Irish and German and morals, I just thought they were sort of stupid.
As a novelist, you must have found it a challenge to work with such a heavy character load. I mean, even among Mann's family, there's 6 children, and they don't like him. He's receiving prizes and awards, and he gets a letter from his son saying, I just want you to know that your children feel very differently about your entire your entire career.
Look, the
and the
first
other
thing is,
Katya comes off. What?
If I was giving advice to a young writer, the way you're always saying, would you have advice to give to a young writer? Yeah, I would say don't have 6 children in any of your families. Do not do that, because it's really technically, first of all, forget the emotional stuff. Technically, it's really hard to do, because in every chapter you have to have some mention of each of them, or the reader will forget which is Monica, which is Michael. Monica and Michael, up to 6 children, are the hardest to deal with.
And you have several Klauses in there as well.
Yes, and you have 3 classes, and so you have to keep all that going, and also you also have to make it work. In other words, in the 1920s, 2 of Thomas Mann's children, Eric and Klaus, became poster children for the new freedom, and they did what they liked, said what they liked, wore what they liked, and slept with whom they liked. And obviously, you have to make this work not just as information, but as a part of a pattern, where you watch their father watching them, and you see from his point of view what that looks like, and you realize, first of all, that it's doomed in some way, that he's watching his son, who wants to be a writer, much more interested in being photographed than being on his own in a study, and you realize it's going to end badly. But also, this reflects back on him, his own reticence, his own refusal, in a way, to sort of emerge into the light. So you have to make it into pattern all the time. But you are dealing, I suppose, with the problem is you're dealing also with the really large 20th century, the First World War, the Second World War, and in both cases, Thomas Mann's response is rich. It's complex, and you have to move in slow time, especially with the First World War, where his reading reaction, he was so militaristic and so wrong.
Yes,
you have to make that sense of that in slow time. And so there are constant challenges, and that may explain why leaving out things becomes really important, because you have to include so much.
You might say that Mann was unlucky in his children, but I think he was very fortunate in his wife, who comes alive in your book to a greater degree than I think anybody would realize, even who had read a biography of Mann. Did you do something to make Katya more sympathetic or full?
She wrote a wonderful book, or she dictated a book when she was old. She lived into her 90s, called Unwritten Memories, and it just shows you what a tolerant and interesting and wise person she was. I became fascinated by her background. In other words, being an assimilated Jew in Munich, very rich family. Her father was also a professor.
Culturally rich too.
What's that?
Culturally rich as well.
Yeah. That, in other words, her brother was studying conducting with Gustav Mahler. They had funded Bayreuth. I mean, they knew the Wagners. And these were really cultured people. And it was that idea of assimilation that meant that you assimilated as much as you could, even more than you should, into the culture. And Thomas Mann was a provincial and walked into this world in which homosexuality, they knew about that. Her grandmother, this is in about 1905, her grandmother was the most famous feminist in Germany. And these were bohemian people who lived very well, and so she was the only daughter. She was one of the first women to study science at a university in Germany. And when I say she gave this up to marry him, it wasn't as though she lost a great deal. That her extraordinary intelligence and her sort of grace under pressure, her way of being ahead of him all the time. And what I had to do was simply, every time Katya Mann appears in this book, she's going to say something interesting. Every time, you say Katya comes into the room, and you realize the reader is going to sit up saying, oh, great, what's she going to do now? It's not as though she's going to do anything eccentric, but it is that she's always going to be witty, that she's always going to have a funny sentence, a clever way of putting things. And so that the creation, you see, the issue was to create a marriage that wasn't going to make her sad. And so the cliche would have been, oh, closeted homosexual is married to a woman, she gets all sad. To try and do something like that would make it more interesting, as I think it was more interesting. So the creation of her was it began as a challenge. I had to put a lot of thought into it, but then it amused me once. Oh my God! I think Katya is going to come and say something now to him, and I'm going to make that, I'm going to take pleasure in that. So there was a sense of enjoying her presence in the book.
You know, that the word you used, assimilation, might be one of the words that you might use to describe the entire project. I was very moved by the conclusion in which the typical clarity and efficiency of your prose gave way to something more lyrical in this kind of dreamy vignette of Bach hacking his way through the vegetation to get to the place where the composer Buxtehude is, and he sits at the feet of Buxtehude, who reveals to him the secret of art, which is beauty. And that comes, I have to say, unexpectedly. And I'd like you to comment on the force of the imperative of beauty for you.
I wanted to make my way out of the book with some totalizing image, with some image that went way above everything, and that gave him a Lübeck. You know, Buxtehude is the organist in Lübeck. If you recently, when I was in Lübeck, you know, Sunday morning, every church, someone's singing Buxtehude, or the choir's belting out Buxtehude, or the organ. He wrote a lot of organ music. And Mann discovers that Buxtehude's grave was simply pulverized in the bombing of Lübeck in 1942, and so like his grave has gone. And so, but Mann goes to the church. He goes to the Dom on the Sunday morning. He's 80 years old. He's back in Lübeck. What comes back into his mind is what the novel begins with, which is his mother talk. His father, of course, is always at a meeting. My father was always at a meeting, and his mother is just telling a story. And the first story is all about her life in Brazil, and the last story is a story about a sort of magic story that you can find in any book about Buxtehude or Bach. Bach walking across Germany as a young composer to find this man, Buxtehude, who will teach him something. And then as I was working, I said, well, what did he teach him? Because she's talking to children. There can't be technical about, you know, he taught him how to do stops on the organ. And she just said he taught him beauty. And then she says, you know, later on, when Bach was on his way home, he played for a woman in a house, and she thought the music had come from heaven. And I suppose it's that idea of man hearing when he's young, but that idea that art could not just matter, but rise above things, and soar above things, as in a way, in his first novel, Buddenbrooks, had the young Hanno, the boy, so delicate, his health is so bad, but he begins to play the harpsichord, and the harpsichord begins to take over his life. So the idea of the sickliness and beauty going together, and it will always be in his work. You know, in Dr. Faust at the very end, the whole idea of listening to Beethoven, of thinking about the German tradition in music. But the problem for Bach, or the problem for Mann, became he realized that Hitler had loved the same music, some of the same music as he did. Now, that's a difficult one. I mean, in other words, if you had to just think now that you were at home listening to some beautiful music, and that Donald Trump had loved that music too, you really have to say, well, what am I doing listening to this music? And Mann had to realize that the unsettling of the spirit that occurred in the 19th century German music, symphonic music and choral music, that great unsettling, the great symphony orchestra were lifting people out of themselves, that had unsettled spirits in poisonous ways, as well as in ways that were beautiful and delicate. And he had to think about that. In America, he spoke very beautifully, and you know, it must have puzzled people, saying, Hitler, he wrote an essay called Hitler, Our Brother. You know, that in other words, it wasn't as though there were two Germanys, that there was one culture, but that one culture had poisoned the population as well as uplifted it. In the uplifting, it had done something dangerous. And he had to think about that, so that idea of beauty comes ambiguously as well as coming as a children's story.
It seemed to me that when you introduced this little vignette, you were making a comment on Mann's life, but it seemed a little unmotivated. And what I was really asking was, does this imperative of beauty impinge on you in any way? Is this something that you feel all the time? Does it override other imperatives?
Yes, there are times in a novel, and I think this happens in Thomas Mann, where you have been writing too much social stuff in pages. You know, who is in the room, who is eating what. Mann is so good with money, and say that novel Buddenbrooks, which is about a commercial family, and what he has to try and do sometimes, you can watch him doing, is lifting that idea out of itself into some other realm. For example, when the senator is dying, he reads Schopenhauer, and he hasn't read philosophy before. He finds the book by accident, and it really takes him over and overwhelms him, this idea of what death means in Schopenhauer. Yeah. And that's what I'm talking about, the idea that somehow you lift the novel from its social occasions into some realm which is philosophical or quasi-religious. And you're always worried about, if you don't do that, you end up with something that's too rooted, too dull, too locked into society and the ordinariness of life, that you've got to do something, one more thing to the novel. I had this thing about, it just needs one more thing. And often what it needs is some moment where the language just stops or does something strange, or you twist a sentence around, or you write a paragraph that doesn't actually give you any information at all, but actually just holds you for a second, almost like something in music might. So I'm thinking about something like that, that if you don't have it in a novel, you then get a piece of social reportage, which is all very well, it might be useful in some way, but it isn't enough. It just isn't enough. And so what I'm thinking about that idea at the end of the day, it's a story told to children about beauty. So it's pretty simplified, but nonetheless, it's serious, and I mean it. And the effort is just to get to lift the thing up from the merely human into some of the realm.
Right. Some of the mystery, isn't it, is the smallness of the alteration that it takes to transform social reportage into something beautiful. Sometimes it can be something very, very...
yes, and you see, it's delicate. And if you overdo it, if you showed too much that you were doing it, the reader would laugh. And laugh at you. In other words, that it's not something that can be... it really has to be handled very delicately. Mm-hmm.
Mann, at one point, imagines dream readers, that it must be intoxicating reverie about the ideal reader who, I think the phrase is, readers who are currently living in shadows, but who might emerge into daylight if he could create the right atmosphere and tone. I suspect that all writers imagine their ideal readers. Do you ever have such reveries, and would you like to share them?
See, I think things really changed in Ireland as I was growing up, that from a period of great censorship where, most important books were banned until the early 60s. I think what grew up in this, especially as I was starting to write, was a whole set of readers in Ireland that, took a new book very seriously. And a lot of writers, Irish writers before, writers like Flann O'Brien, and, wrote as though there would never be a reader. And often there wasn't a reader. Flann O'Brien's book sold 39 copies. And it's almost like Borges in Argentina realizing, no Argentine's ever going to read me, so I'm going to write as though the reader is built into the text I'm writing, writing playful sort of modernist text in that way. That hasn't happened in the Ireland that I know. And Thomas Mann is thinking about that idea that even as Hitler is growing, he's giving readings all over Germany, and large numbers of serious people who spend the winter reading, who live in lamplight in the evenings, and live seriously sensuous lives as readers. That they are attending, and that is one of the Germanies. There are other Germanies that are really coming towards him poisonously, but this one is the one that he feels he controls. And that's why when he loses Germany and loses that readership, he doesn't know, why am I writing these sentences in German if they can never appear in that language?
You've lived all over, you're in Los Angeles now and on your way to South America tomorrow. Is there any country where you feel that the readers of your work are privileged because they have unique access to your sensibility? Do you feel more at home in Ireland than you do elsewhere, or have you found homes elsewhere?
I suppose Ireland is home, and I have a sense of readers there that I mightn't have in China. But what's strange is how things travel, how things move. And I'm not just talking about these novels that you mentioned, The Master and The Magician, as being sort of international novels, but even the Irish novels, the ones that are set very locally in places that I know, it's funny how those things can move. And as a reader, I understand that perfectly. That's what I want from a Chinese novelist, where I can enter into the spirit of some other imagination, but also some other place.
I interviewed in this format Richard Ford last year, and when he heard that I was going to, and he has a blurb on The Magician on the back of the book, and so you're obviously close with him. And when he heard that I was going to be talking to you this year, he proposed his own set of interview questions. They're very different from the kinds of questions I've been asking you, but they are writer-to-writer questions. So I'd like to pose a couple to you.
These are from Richard.
These are from Richard. That's right. Richard, if you're listening, although I think he's in an airplane right now, but he will. What are the hardest things for you to do? And his example was stopping one day and starting the next.
No, I don't have any trouble with that.
Okay. When you go back over sentences after writing them, what are you doing?
And the first time I write them, my job is to make them stick. So I don't write tentatively. I write definitively. Sometimes I fail, so that you then have to do something. But you can never rescue a novel by rewriting if it isn't right. If you haven't got the rhythm down, the basic rhythm, the basic sound of things, the basic way in which things are going to unfold, you cannot get it back by rewriting, by editing. It won't come again. So therefore, the first time you work has to be very intense, with the feeling that you might never get another chance to do this. And if you don't do that, you end up with this lazy draft that you cannot rescue.
Yeah. This is so interesting. A couple of years ago, I read an account by Hilary Mantel, and she was talking about writing, and she used that very word, rhythm. She said, I read a bunch of things, I think of things, but it's only when I get the rhythm in my head. And she didn't say the rhythm of what? The rhythm of the chapters, the rhythm of the sentences, of the words themselves, but the concept of rhythm, like a certain kind of pulse. And she said, then she was in a position to create.
Yeah, it's got something to do with breath. The reader reads silently, but oddly enough, prose has a sound. Prose, silent prose has a sound. If the rhythm, that entirely depends on the rhythm. In other words, if it's just information, it's dead. Sometimes you can read a novel and think there's something dead here. But if you overdo the rhythm, of course, you lose people even more. But it has to be there as a way of handling, as though you're a singer handling breath, holding breath, taking breath here, letting a line go 1-2 words more into the next line. And so that you're working all the time with the excitement of an inner sound that actually binds things together, that holds emotion, that releases emotion, that conceals emotion. And that's what you're working with. Like
a pulse.
Yes, it's got to seem as natural as a pulse.
Yeah. I see a question popping up, and so I'll pose it to you from the audience. Personally, I struggle with the revision process. Could you speak about how you go about revising? What challenges did this book provide you, other than the massive cuts you executed? I suspect that you've answered this in part already. But
but you also, exercise small cuts. You often find that a paragraph, you often find the last sentence of a paragraph is just not necessary. You realize, if I just get that sentence out, that will seem, it just will seem more natural again. So the rereading, just the going over reading a thing, especially rereading in the morning when you're much more suspicious of everything, as I am, where, and you just cut things, but also sometimes you realize that that paragraph needs to be rewritten, not just cut and just simply taken out and redone. And but you have to do that in relation to the previous paragraph and the one that comes after. But the main thing is, when you're working the first time, concentrate so hard with the idea that you will not get a chance to revise.
It's interesting that you mentioned the morning, because Mann always worked in the morning, and many writers work in the morning. Do you cycle through a series of emotions during the day where you're skeptical in the morning and then maybe refined at night?
I often have a tremendously good idea at night, a wildly wonderful idea at night that is real rubbish. And the lovely thing is, whatever happens to the blood sugar, the whole body simply does something else in the morning that means that idea just simply.
As a matter of fact, Gustav von Aschenbach always writes in the morning, doesn't he? When the kind of fiery imagination that he's assembled during his dream life is most accessible. Richard Ford would also like to know, this is writer to writer, what you're best at, what you consider yourself best at.
I suppose is the question of emotion, the question of what to do with it and when to release it, and when to know that this is the moment that you can now, I'm talking about payoff, the idea that you have been writing plainly, as you said, just very efficient sentences, and that has given you permission now to do one thing here, but you'll only get it once, do it now. And it might just be a line of dialogue, it might be a paragraph, it might be a twist in a sentence, but I think I know how to do that.
Uh-huh. What do you find most difficult as a writer?
I don't know. I can't answer that. Let me think. I don't know.
Introducing a character?
No.
No, that's not difficult.
No.
What? And here is a Richard question as well. What are the personal or simply human qualities it takes to be a novelist? And I gather that this comes from a kind of deep, inarticulate interest that writers must have. That, in other words, they know that they're writers, but they don't necessarily know what qualifies them to be so or what makes them able to be so. What's your answer?
I'm not sure what being a writer really means. You're just working on the next thing. And you discover along the way that there are things that obviously interest you because they keep appearing in books. And they seem to me to be things that arise from what I would call unresolved experience, or experience that has been concealed or has been so difficult that you don't know really what to do with it. And so I think I'm still living in the shadow of the death of my father, that I'm still a 12-year-old in a state of shock trying to work out what this means. And I'm still working out trying to find images that both evade it and confront it. And so, often maybe just one experience is enough to nourish a whole life working. But there may be other things that I don't know the names of that have really mattered to me, that make their way into the books all the time, and that really impel me, make me go on, make me want to write this down and do this. And there's a satisfaction in that, oddly enough. It's not like psychoanalysis. It's like going to a shrink. It's actually exploiting it, or using it in ways, taking it over, owning it.
Do you see the life of a writer as a profession, or do you see it as a calling? In other words, is it a way of life, or is it a skill that you have?
Honestly, it's not a calling. I promise you, it's not a calling. It's not like a vocation to the priesthood. That's just a completely different thing. And what was the first one? What was it? Was it a
skill? Is it a skill or is it a calling? Is it something you can do, an aptitude, or?
You see, I think that you just take it book by book. That if you're working on a book, then you've got to work out, what do you need to do with this book? But if you start thinking about yourself as some sort of priest figure, or as some sort of even artist figure, you sort of lose the idea that today I'm not going to write anything. But so I think you better take it as a sort of journeyman, as someone who just every so often gets a project, attempts to do the project properly, because writing is a form of communication. It's not a form of self-expression. The page is blank. It is not a mirror. And when you look into it, you do not see, you've got to fill it. And often it's just a question of work. It's a question of, like, today I must do this.
It's not a form of self-expression, really.
No, you see, if it were a form of self-expression, you really wouldn't need to finish some books, because you think, well, I know the end of this book. I know it's coming. Why should I bother finishing it? It's not written for me. But it's written in the same way as people early on wanted to make drawings of animals in caves, which were to delight others. And that's the purpose, is to delight others. It's a form of communication. It's almost like the singer relationship to the song. It's the song is for others. The song is for people to hear.
Would you say it's a form of self-nullification or self-distancing then, if it's not a form of self-expression?
I would say that at the very center of it is self-suppression and self-abnegation. That you're actually thinking, as I say, the page is not a mirror. That your job is to actually make this as something that hasn't been there before. It's not a question of letting the world know what a big boy I am, or what a great guy I am, or also what a tortured, tormented, poor soul I am. Just tell the story. Just get the next sentence done right.
Here's the last question, I'm told. You write in so many formats: plays, poems, novels, essays. When an idea comes to you, does it arrive in its final form? In other words, I think, does the genre match the idea instantly and unproblematically?
I had a pandemic where I spent a lot of time alone, and started to write poetry again after the first time reading it, because I was 20. So I have my first book of poems coming out in April. And so there were things I've never been able to say. I couldn't work out a way of saying, even just memories, just tiny things. And they've made their way into poems. So, I was thinking for ages about it. We had a referendum on same-sex marriage in Ireland, and it was a great day. It was a great victory. And I was trying to think, though, about two guys in their 60s who really weren't going to benefit from this. That they were just, they didn't go to the clubs anymore. They didn't feel welcome in the gay places, which are so filled with young people. And on that Saturday, when the votes were being counted, they turn up and feel excluded in some way from all the joy. And I kept thinking about it as a story, as to how I would do it. And then I couldn't work it out as a story, because I couldn't work out a way out of it. But I couldn't get a sense of it lifting above their dilemma into some other realm. But actually, it became a poem, and that's the first time that's happened, where something that I was toying with for fiction moved into a poem. So now that I'm writing poetry, maybe I'll do that more. But usually, everything has its own form, and also, writers have a DNA, and my DNA is that I'm basically a novelist. The other things I do are extra, like writing plays, or writing poetry, or writing stories, or writing essays. But the basic thing I do. So I'm always thinking about a novel. I have a novel on the boil, and every day some new image or some new way of looking at something comes in. I live with that, even days when I'm not writing, maybe especially days when I'm not writing. I live with, that moment when she meets her on the street. What if she said that to her? Do we need to know more about someone's earlier life, or should I just leave that out? Which is always the big question with fiction. How much do you need to tell about somebody in order for that person to come alive? And so in other words, in The Magician, we never see anything from Katia Mann's point of view. But yet, my job is to make her come even more alive by virtue of what she says, how she appears, but mainly what she says. And whereas Thomas Mann does all the watching and thinking.
Well, Colm, I want to thank you for this magical conversation. The book is called The Magician, and thanks so much, not only to you, but also to our viewers, wherever you are and whenever you may be seeing this. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. That was very enjoyable. Thank you. Thank you.